20,000 garments, warehouse-sized personal archives, luxury storage companies promising to preserve clothing like museum artifacts. Is the personal archive movement really about preserving history, or is it just the elitist way to justify overconsumption? This is the rise of the personal fashion archive. I'm Leigh, a sustainable, self-taught fashion designer and fiber artist with over 10 years of fashion industry experience. I am a lifelong lover of high fashion. I would also consider myself a collector of high fashion. What's really the difference between archiving clothing and overconsumption? If this makes you feel conflicted, maybe a little bit uncomfortable, you're in the right place, because that's exactly what we're unpacking in today's episode. But more importantly, I want to discuss why the mentality behind one of the most famous personal archives in history from Azzedine and Alaïa might actually be hurting the future of sustainable fashion. So what's really going on here, and what's your take on it? Let's discuss. So Azzedine Alaïa set up his shop in Paris right at the tail end of the golden age of mid-century fashion. But Alaïa wasn't just a designer, he was also a collector. When he passed, he left behind over 20,000 garments, sketches, and accessories, preserving what he called the greatest masters in fashion history, leading to its inclusion in this book, Collecting Fashion, as well as a universally lauded exhibit by his foundation featuring a curated selection of these pieces. So what's the problem here, right? Well, not all fashion archives are as noble as they might seem. So a fashion archive is a collection of clothing that reflects a specific era or a moment in history. Great examples are the fashion collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art or the Victorian Albert Museum. One of the roots of this discussion isn't just about collecting fashion, it's about the choice to not wear the pieces that you're collecting, which is taking the view that collecting fashion isn't just about collecting clothes, it's actually a form of art collection. But if you're just stashing it in a storage unit, how is that different from anyone else's overconsumption? And even Alaïa's archive wasn't immune to this issue. But that little nugget didn't actually come from this book. It came from one of my personal experiences, which I'll share in just a moment. The putting of these fashion archives into storage starts to sound very quickly a lot less like fashion preservation and more like how some art collectors buy rare works, just use them as tax havens, locking away priceless pieces, not because they appreciate them, but just because they can. But do you think fashion actually qualifies as art? I personally think the answer is yes and no, but let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments. Are people actually collecting fashion to capture a story about a person, place, or time? Or is the goal of archiving just a way to justify the excess? The rise of the personal archive has made the behavior of having unworn pieces and lots of them stored in a specific way very acceptable, as long as you call it curation. The personal fashion archive isn't a new concept. Let me get you some books for reference. So we have examples of entire museum exhibits dedicated to individual people's personal collections, like Anne Bonfoy Taylor, who recently had an exhibit at the Phoenix Art Museum that kind of broke the internet, all featuring her personal fashion collection, including a lot of pieces made by her, but also just a lot of expensive things. More recently, you may remember the website, the Couture, which came into people's homes to very beautifully photograph and capture extensive collections of designer garments in the early 2010s. And I remember feeling like the website was such a unique peek into people's personal lives. If we take it purely at face value that collecting fashion or having a collection immediately means overconsumption, we might miss some nuances important to finding sustainable solutions in the future. It's something that honestly I have fallen prey to. I was at, I think it was my first Paris Fashion Week, and somebody told me about Marine Serre, a French fashion designer's supposedly legendary vintage fashion archive. I tried to corroborate that specific story. All I came up with is how innovative Marine Serre is. Get this, in her development of an in-house supply chain to upcycle garments, she's able to use almost entirely recycled and upcycled materials in her collections. So if she does in fact also have just a vintage archive that she never touches, all I can say is she's putting it to good use. No notes from me on that. But returning to our main topic, there's a very real double standard between personal fashion archives and regular overconsumption that we can't ignore. So luxury collectors get praised for preserving fashion history, while the average person with an overflowing closet or storage unit of clothes is told they're being wasteful and unsustainable. But when you strip away that perceived white knighting of conservationism, the behaviors start to look very similar. Another element of this is actually the psychology of fashion collection excess. And this book actually does a decent job. It has an intro piece by a doctor who I'm assuming is a psychologist, noting that what makes fashion archives different is that they hold immense personal value. But here's the thing, owning something just because it has a lot of personal value is absolutely fine, but collecting rare things and calling it an archive just because it means something to you does not have the same value from a historical curation perspective. And most of the fashion that's being collected isn't even historically relevant. And we're actually seeing this play out right now. So I get my US Vogues a little bit late in Germany, and I just got the Winter Vogue edition. In it, they had a piece where a writer was chronicling her adventures, searching in vintage shops and on secondhand markets for 2000s Prada and Nicolas Ghesquière era Balenciaga shoes specifically. Not because they're revolutionary, but because they meant something to her. The market and collectors aren't valuing it for their historical significance, which the word archive would suggest, but rather for their very current, very of the moment cultural relevance. And, shocker, they're trendy again, as a similar version was recently sent down the runways. So in reality, are so many of these personal archives really just hype-driven closets? So when you take away that very elite marketplace, the behaviors do start to mimic the same unsustainable behaviors of just general consumerism. You know, buying things that overflow your space and require additional storage. A recent study found that in the US, 19% of storage units are just full of clothing of average people. And then also valuing those items based on hype, not history. Because let's be honest here, that Vogue article used the term true vintage, which means that something has to be over 20 years old, in case you didn't know that. But people are archiving things that are less than 20 years old and using the term vintage, which technically doesn't even apply yet. One of my personal biggest issues with it is keeping things boxed away rather than letting them be worn, used, appreciated, or perhaps even repurposed. So what about true rare fashion preservation? That might make you argue that Azzedine Alaïa's collection was actually different than the other examples. He focused on technique, craftsmanship, and preserving the work of otherwise forgotten designers, of which we don't actually have many examples of their work. But is that really an exception, or is it the rule? And how do we feel about that, knowing that Alaïa routinely outbid museums who would put these pieces on display in order to add them to his personal archive, storage. You get where I'm going here with this. I virtually attended the launch for this book. Alexander Fury's visits to Azzedine and Alaïa, as they're chronicled in the book, seem quite tame. When Alaïa's team actually went in to start archiving and chronicling the collections, they were shocked by how much clothing there was. And Alaïa really didn't even have any concept of how much he had. So many things had just been purchased and left in storage and then buried. But none of that ended up in the book. So for me, it's not about people collecting fashion or that social currency. I too love and adore fashion and fashion history. The real issue that I have here is the example of Alaïa's archive put on a pedestal. So what's your take on this whole fashion collecting thing? Are we truly archiving, or is it just overconsumption in an expensive elitist outfit? And does whether or not you're wearing the clothes actually matter? Because I mean, I think it does. The reason why I think this movement to preserve fashion is so detrimental comes from the lack of examination of why Azzedine Alaïa started collecting in the first place. So there's a story they mention in the book. Alaïa had a lot of couture clients, and one client, she was having Alaïa make her a skirt, and she brought him an old Balenciaga dress and wanted him to cut it up and use the fabric as the lining for the new piece. And in the recounting in the book, they say it sparked something in him that said, I started to realize I had to protect these pieces. He then went on to note that that same client left him an extensive library of Balenciaga pieces with specific instructions to basically rework these pieces for his clients, use them just as fabric. He did not do that and instead left them intact, set them aside, and added them to his archive. Can you imagine if Kim Kardashian went to Demna, the current designer for Balenciaga, and said, no new fabric. If you want me to wear your designs, you have to make them from pieces they already own. And then she gave them old clothes to make new pieces. Or perhaps if Emma Chamberlain, instead of donating all of her clothing, brought those unwanted clothes to her next Met Gala fitting and said, can you make it from these? As wild and bizarre as that scenario about reusing and repurposing designer garments might sound, it was actually the norm when Alaïa first started collecting. And with just Americans discarding over 34 billion pounds of used textiles annually, roughly 100 pounds per person per year, upcycling and recycling garments is an out-of-the-box solution that we can't afford to ignore. And as a designer who does believe that you can build an entire business off of upcycled garments, it's so incredibly frustrating to have that story told about Alaïa, how he started collecting, and have the sustainable potential of that be ignored while we just say, oh, but look, he left us this incredible archive. How wonderful. I'm very curious about your thoughts, and I can't wait to read your comments on the subject. We did gloss over archives in the role of fashion education. That was actually quite intentional because there's so much to unpack there, and unpack it we will in the next episode. If you have any questions that you're hoping that we'll answer, just click the link below for the newsletter. You can just sign up, it's free, and I will look forward to continuing that discussion. Thank you again for watching. I'm Leigh, and I will see you next time.
Wait for the day that they get a fashion girly on that show, Hoarders. And the garbage guy will be like, all right, toss or keep. And the old lady will be like, no, that's archive Margiela.